Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board. Tonight I want to talk a little bit about making yourself stand out from the crowd. I already talked a little bit about that when I talked about being avant-garde, and the impact, the visual impact of having a unique art style, and how beneficial that can be for someone who's looking to market their art. Of course, your art has to be good. You have to have a good quality product to sell someone before marketing will do you much good. But once you have a good quality product, you have to make that product stand out and be memorable, because there's a lot of other people out there that also have what they think are good quality products trying to sell them. So how are you going to do that? Of course, comic books invented an entirely new genre to help them stand out from the crowd. There was already, radio plays and novels telling all kinds of pulp noir stories when comic books first came out, or fantasies like Tarzan, and swashbuckling adventures like Treasure Island, things like that. So comic books, they actually invented an entire new genre. They invented the superhero, and they kind of stole the trappings of circus performers and the sense of swashbuckling action that came in some stories. But they gave them a new context. They created new tropes, things like the supervillain and the superhero, the costumes. They kind of all mashed it up to create a new genre. Now, not everyone can do that. Not everyone should do that. But there are other simpler ways to make your work stand out. So think, for example, about Doug TenNapel's Bigfoot Bill. And I know I used that as an example in my last video on standing out, but it's because I think that story really did stand out in the Comicsgate field. There were a lot of other high quality comics being offered around that time, but Doug did something very unique. He took a cryptid and he put him at the center of the story. Of course, Bigfoots are a kind of paranormal creature, and while there have occasionally been paranormal creatures at the center of comic books, they're usually something fairly run of the mill. Something like a vampire or mutants could kind of be considered like cryptids, I suppose, if you want to think of them that way. But Bill is a very obviously non-human character, and he's at the center of Bigfoot Bill, and that really makes it stand out. It's not like there haven't been stories about cryptids or even comic books about cryptids. But by putting the cryptid at the heart of the story, Doug made a very unique looking comic. Another thing you can do is you can do a mashup. My own project that I'm working on here is a bit of a mashup. Hexwood is basically a spaghetti western at the heart of it, but it also has elements of fantasy and magic. The villain and a couple of other characters draw their powers from a fire elemental, the primeval fire elemental to be specific. Likewise, they don't use guns. I decided to take the element of guns out of it, and instead, their magic weapons are double as melee weapons and ranged weapons. So people still carry swords or spears or axes, and they don't need a separate weapon to shoot at someone. They can just throw fire bolts or similar things like that. So the gun is kind of unnecessary in their society because they have enough magic to replace the effect. Instead of mining just for gold, they mine for magic materials that help them make their weapons and the other parts of their society, like I don't know, a flying train maybe. So yeah, that it is basically a spaghetti western. It has a lot of the tropes. There are Indians and sheriffs and outlaws and cowboys and miners and all these other things. But that touch of magic makes it a bit different. As does eschewing the gun, which is usually a big part of the Western. Um, so a mashup is another way you can look for elements to make your story stand out without having to completely reinvent the wheel. And maybe you're thinking, what's wrong with reinventing the wheel? Well, the answer is because the wheel is really efficient. It's a good piece of technology. You don't want to spend all that time going through the process of creating and imagining and testing and rewriting and retesting a bunch of tropes and ideas and world building. Sometimes you want to get on with telling your story, and a trope mashup can do that. Another thing you can do without having to completely reinvent the wheel is you can take a story you liked and you can look for something that was missing in it, and you can add in that missing element and make it a big part of the story. An example of this is The Matrix. Now, The Matrix is a pretty good story. At least the first film is a pretty good story. It has a lot of cool elements to it. Cyberpunk. The dystopia, the hacking, a chosen one, destiny, romance, things like that. However, it doesn't have a very good soundtrack. I mean, think of it. Can you remember any piece of music that might have been in the background while watching The Matrix? So what if you instead of just telling a cyberpunk story, you decided, I'm going to tell a cyberpunk story, and all the cyberpunk elements are going to revolve around music, and we get a really cyberpunk feeling music group, like say Daft Punk, or maybe if you're still into dubstep, you get someone like Skrillex or something like that. Was never a fan of dubstep myself. Don't at me. But yeah, just by adding that element, you can completely change the story. And sure, there was nothing terribly original about The Matrix to begin with, but it delivered in a very slick, memorable, unique way with new camera techniques and a lot of other cool things going on in it. So if you find a way to add something really slick and new to your story, you can stand out that way. Of course, again, you still need a good story to back up all those slick and new elements. But if you have the slick and the new to kind of help you stand out, man, that will really help you get an audience. So, to recap, find something to make yourself stand out. It can be your art style. It can be the kind of story you're telling. And these are the most simple and most obvious ways to make yourself stand out. But there are other ways to do it. Tell a familiar story with an unfamiliar character at the helm. Take two kinds of stories and really mash them together and see what comes of that. Or just, take a great story and add that one thing that would have made it perfect and really emphasize it. These are the ways you can make yourself stand out from a crowd. When I was in college, I had a professor, and he was always saying, there are no new stories. If you've ever heard of the 7 basic stories, he was a big proponent of that. And while that kind of way of looking at your story can feel limiting, it's also illuminating. It does show you that there's only so many things you can do with the basic structure of a story. And while it's good to, play around with those from time to time, there's also nothing wrong with just, relaxing and letting them carry you along while you riff like a jazz musician or a soloist. And a lot of art is just taking the existing rules and riffing on them. It's great if you can be totally original, but that's not going to be every time. Don't let great be the enemy of good. Just find one thing, and one thing will usually be enough to make your story stand out. Anyway, that's all I got for tonight. There's a like and subscribe button down below. Use them as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.